This week, we'll examine a Southeast Asian state that, despite being highly complex and populous like all states, is nevertheless organized in a manner very different from our own. The Minangkabau Kingdom of Indonesia embraced a series of seemingly contradictory principles, finding balance and stability among them. First, as always, the location and environmental setting. The Minangkabau Kingdom, though it does not exist anymore, was located in what we now call Indonesia. Indonesia as a whole consists of over 13,000 islands, stretching across over 3,000 miles from east to west. In terms of breadth, it is roughly the extent of the continental United States. Its population is about 265 million, making it the most populous majority Muslim nation in the world. Indonesia is also very ethnically diverse, with hundreds of different cultural groups. The Minangkabau people are one of the most numerous in modern Indonesia, numbering about 4 million people, mostly living in the western part of Sumatra, where their kingdom was once centered. Sumatra is a large island facing the Indian Ocean on the western end of Indonesia. The equator passes through the island, so it has a warm, tropical climate year-round, with plenty of rain. Mountains run along the central axis of the island. The eastern coast is swampy and inhospitable, but the central plateau and west coast are in many ways ideal for large populations. The Minangkabau are farmers, like most Indonesian ethnic groups and all state-organized groups. In the warm, well-watered interior of Sumatra, they grow large crops of a variety of vegetables and rice. They also produce several cash crops for export and sale on the international market. The most important of these is coffee, the cultivation of which was encouraged by Indonesia's colonial rulers in the 18th and 19th centuries. The history of the Minangkabau Kingdom illustrates some important lessons about how states form. India, to the north and west of Sumatra, was one of the first places on Earth that early states developed several thousand years ago. From perhaps the 5th century AD, the influence of these nearby states was seen in Sumatra. As cultures evolve over time, they can shift up and down the scale of social complexity, going up from tribes to chiefdoms or down from chiefdoms to bands, for example. Any shift is possible under certain circumstances, but of course some changes are more likely than others, and what kinds of organizational changes occur in a culture depends greatly on the kinds of pressure its people experience. When states first developed in India, they did so because of internal forces, population growth, new technologies, etc. This makes Indian civilization a primary state. But once Indian states existed on the subcontinent, their influence, through trade, prestige, military might, etc., was felt by neighboring cultures throughout South and Southeast Asia. So eventually those cultures began to acculturate and adopt Indian cultural traits, features of organization, religion, and so forth. When states emerged among those cultures, as they did in Sumatra in the 5th century, they were doing so because of external forces, hence what anthropologists call secondary states. Interestingly enough, the Minangkabau Kingdom developed as a secondary state under the influence of the Srivijaya Empire, itself a secondary state centered in the southern part of the island. Srivijaya was influenced by India, and as it waned in the 14th century, the Minangkabau Kingdom began to consolidate and exert its own influence throughout the island. As an independent and powerful kingdom, Minangkabau lasted about 500 years, from roughly 1350 to about 1850. By the end of this time, most of Indonesia was largely under the control of the Dutch government and ruled as part of the Dutch colonial empire. The Minangkabau kings were allowed to continue in office, however, and acted largely as agents of the colonial rulers. Following a series of civil wars in the middle of the 19th century, however, the native kings were finally removed completely and direct Dutch rule was instituted. Ironically, however, this final loss of autonomy fired a new sense of Indonesian nationalism, which led ultimately to Indonesian independence after World War II. Minangkabau leaders were prominent in this independence movement and continue to play a prominent role in Indonesia government today. During those centuries of self-rule, however, the Minangkabau kingdom was an excellent example of state-level organization. The kingdom was traditionally divided into two broad regions, the Darat and the Rantau. Darat referred to the highlands where most Minangkabau lived in central Sumatra, with wide, rich agricultural lands. The Darat was densely populated and firmly Minangkabau. The Rantau, on the other hand, referred to the peripheral provinces along the western and northern coasts of Sumatra. These parts of the kingdom were more accessible for trade, but consequently the people there were more likely to belong to other ethnic groups, and life there was not quite so familiar. Because of this distinction, the terms Darat and Rantau came to have metaphorical meanings beyond their simple geographical regions. Darat came to embody everything essentially Minangkabau, everything right and predictable. Rantau, metaphorically, took on the meaning of foreign, unpredictable, and potentially confusing. Even so, the Rantau was essential for Minangkabau life. Foreign trade goods were only available there. And as the population rose in the Darat, people naturally had to expand into the Rantau to find farmland to make a living. Whether in the Darat or the Rantau, the basic Minangkabau community is known as the Nagari. This is usually translated as village, but Nagari are typically much larger than villages elsewhere in the world, with populations often in the several thousands. Large populations, of course, are characteristic of state societies. Each Nagari is governed by a council of officers known as Penghulu, usually translated as something like clan chief. We'll discuss exactly who becomes Penghulu in a bit when we look more closely at Minangkabau social organization. But for now, let's focus on how the village council governs the village together. To understand anything about Minangkabau governance, we must first understand the concept of Adat, or customary law. One important characteristic of states is the high complexity of government and law necessary to regulate the large populations. Appropriately, the Minangkabau concept of Adat goes far beyond simple rules of customary behavior and instead interweaves with almost every aspect of daily life. It's when we look at how Adat is applied in village councils that we begin to see, again, some of the most essential features of the state organization. The village council consists of all the Penghulu in the village, but every village is not governed in the same way. Some villages follow the Adat of the nobility, and others follow the Adat of the commoners. These are procedural rules that govern how council debates proceed. Under the Adat of the nobility, different clan chiefs are ranked relative to one another, with the voice of some carrying more weight than others. These councils then follow procedures much like the village councils we studied among Samoan chiefdoms. On the other hand, for those villages following the Adat of the commoners, chiefs are all equal to one another, and debate seeks true consensus, a pattern more typical of egalitarian societies. Standing alongside Adat is Islamic tradition and law. The Minangkabau became Muslims around the same time their kingdom emerged, and Muslim principles of law are deeply intertwined with daily life. Interestingly, despite apparent contradictions between the two legal systems, there's been little outright conflict between the two over the centuries, with widespread agreements about which set of laws applies when. Another important dimension of state government is bureaucracy, a specialization of government officials in particular domains of decision-making. This was most obvious in the Minangkabau kingdom at the very top, where three hereditary kings shared power. One of these kings served as the authority governing religious matters having to do with Islam and Islamic law. One ruled over matters of Adat, and the third king, whose title meant King of the World, served as the supreme authority uniting both the native Adat and Islamic laws into one. In a similar way, each Penghulu, in governing his own lineage, would appoint several assistants. One, a judge, one in charge of security, and a third to be a religious advisor. Bureaucratic specialization of this sort is always present in states. This segues nicely into a discussion of the Minangkabau's larger social and economic organization, the features of Minangkabau culture that have made them so famous in anthropological circles. The Minangkabau have been called the largest and most stable matrilineal society in the world today. This means, you'll recall, the children are considered to belong to their mother's family lines rather than their father's. The residents of each Nagari are divided into 4 matrilineal clans, and each clan is then subdivided into 6 lineages. Each lineage has its own chief and serves as the basic unit of social interaction. The lineage, or kaum, operates as a corporate group. This means that all the members of this group act together for common goals. They own property collectively, manage that property collectively, and make decisions collectively. It is the task of the Penghulu and his assistants to ensure that the kaum's resources are used effectively to meet the needs of the kaum. To this end, kaums are also localized. This means that they own a lineage house, a large communal structure where many of the families of the lineage reside. Today, with larger populations and greater wealth available, many members of the lineage choose to live in separate houses, but still very nearby the lineage house. This is because they will essentially report to work there every day. In addition to the lineage house itself, the kaum also owns other resources, farmland and equipment, or factories, stores, or other business assets. This so-called ancestral property cannot be sold or separated from the lineage itself. Since women are the ones whose children will perpetuate the lineage in the future, women are considered to own the lineage's ancestral property and have a great say in how it is used. The daily management of that property, however, is the domain of the Penghulu, who must be a man. This office falls to the oldest male member of the lineage, usually someone Americans would call a great uncle. So while he doesn't own the property, he does have authority to make decisions about how it's used. This highlights one of the fundamental contradictions that arises in matrilineal societies. While descent and inheritance is matrilineal, government is still patriarchal. This places men under great stress. In a society where matrilineages are the basic unit of social interaction, as they are among the Minangkabau, matrilocal residence naturally evolves. When a man marries, he will move out of the house owned by his mother and move in with his wife. She will continue to live in the house owned by her mother, which she will eventually inherit. The couple will raise their children in the house of the children's own matrilineage. This makes sense socially, as it keeps most matrilineage members together to work cooperatively. But the man who moves in with his wife doesn't cease to be a member of his own lineage. Every morning, he will leave the home of his wife to travel to the home he grew up in, to work with his matrilineal kin in their fields or businesses. He'll always remain something of a guest in his wife's house, and he'll become something of a visitor in his own lineage house. Meanwhile, he doesn't even belong to the same lineage as his own biological children. The children of a lineage are its future. In the next generation, they'll take on the management and maintenance of the ancestral property. Part of an adult's responsibilities are to ensure the proper upbringing of the lineage's children to ensure the future health of the lineage. That doesn't extend to a man's own children, but it does include the children of his sister. A child's mother's brother, therefore, takes on the role that, to us, seems more appropriate for the child's own father, while the biological father remains somewhat disconnected and distant. The special relationship between a man and his sister's children in a matrilineal society is known in anthropology as the Avuncular Relationship. It's especially important between a mother's brother and his sister's son. With the management and control of the lineage the responsibility of the men, these two represent the current generation's leadership and his successor in the next. Thus, we might think of the avuncular relationship as a kind of apprenticeship system, where future leaders are readied for tomorrow. On the other hand, the conflicting roles of father and mother's brother produces a lot of contradictory demands on the typical Minangkabau man. He doesn't fully belong to any home, neither his birth home nor his wife's. His own children are mostly being raised by his wife's brother, while he's responsible for guiding his own nieces and nephews, who live in an entirely different household with his sister's husband. Even worse, though he might eventually rise through the ranks of his own lineage to a position of authority, he'll never actually own anything of value and will always have to defer to the wishes of his sisters, who do own the house and land. Such contradictions lead to two other striking features of Minangkabau culture, divorce and Merantau. Let's look at divorce first. A man who divorces will move out of his wife's lineage house and back into his own. This simplifies things greatly, as he's no longer a visitor and now lives alongside his nieces and nephews. Likewise, women are not particularly harmed by divorce. They continue to reside where they always have, and as owners of the lineage's property, they have an assured economic base to continue supporting their family. Traditionally, there have been few drawbacks to divorce beyond the social stigma it draws. Since marriages were traditionally arranged by the elders of the lineage, divorce has long been seen as rejecting their guidance and does draw some stigma. But for many men, this stigma isn't sufficiently great as to outweigh the stresses of married life. Among the Minangkabau, more than half of all marriages have ended in divorce, one of the highest rates in the world. This is decreasing slightly in recent generations, however, due to Indonesian laws discouraging divorce. Also contributing to the decline is the expansion of an old Minangkabau practice, Merantau. Merantau means literally to go to the outlying provinces. Originally, it referred to Minangkabau men traveling to the Rantau provinces to trade or to settle when farmland grew crowded in the Darat. Over time, it has evolved into the custom of young men traveling abroad for several years for work or education. Last week, we introduced the idea of Sojourn Migration, which also describes the modern practice of Merantau. Young married men, and sometimes unmarried men who just want to travel, will leave the Minangkabau's Sumatran homeland for work in Malaysia or elsewhere in Indonesia and remain away for several years. While gone, they send remittances to their lineage back home, thus contributing money instead of labor working the Kaum's fields. Along the way, they also avoid the stresses and contradictions of life as a man in a matrilineal society. After several years, a man will typically return from Merantau. Somewhat older and surer of himself, he's more ready to navigate his roles in two different lineages. If he had children before leaving, those children are now somewhat older, and the potential conflicts between him and his brother-in-law will probably be lessened as well. Thus, Merantau serves as a kind of pressure release valve for a Minangkabau man. Rather than resorting to divorce and drawing judgment upon himself and his Kaum, he can go Merantau for a few years and try his marriage again when he returns. It's probably for this reason that Merantau first developed during the Minangkabau kingdom, and why Minangkabau society remains stable and successful today. The Minangkabau remind us that our own Western traditions are not necessarily universal, and that there are many ways to organize a large state society. They remain today an influential and prosperous people practicing their ancient traditions of Adat in the modern world.